Mr. Becker, could you state for the recording what war and branch of service you served in?
And World War II in the Army.
And what was your rank?
Private first class.
And can you tell me where you served?
Well, do you want a complete listing? Fort Benning, Georgia, University of Cincinnati, Camp Campbell, Kentucky, then went overseas to France, came back, went to West Point, and then to Fort Dix, and finally Camp Croft, South Carolina, where I was discharged in 1945.
Okay. Were you drafted or did
Yes.
you enlist? You drafted.
Yeah.
And did you have a choice of the branch of service that you went into at that time?
Oh, that's so long ago. I think if you wanted to have a choice, you had to enlist in that branch. I think that's the correct way that goes. Friends of mine who went in the Air Force and Marines, as I recall now, yes, I think they enlisted.
Okay. What were you doing at the time that you were drafted?
Well, I was a first-year engineering student at the University of Cincinnati, and I was sort of introduced to the military as an R.O.T.C. student in an aeronautical engineering course at the University of Cincinnati.
So you were in the R.O.T.C. at the
Yes.
time. I see.
Oddly enough, that was a coastal artillery unit, which, why it was inland here, I don't know.
I'm having trouble with the sound. Do you recall your first days? Where were you sent once you were drafted?
Well, all inductees from Cincinnati and surrounding states were sent to Fort Thomas, Kentucky, which is just across the river. And then I was sent to Fort Benning, Georgia for infantry basic training.
And that was the most basic, I guess.
Yes.
And then from there, where did you go?
Well, engineering students were supposedly being saved out into something called Army Specialized Training Corps, ASTP. And oddly enough, of all the students at University of Cincinnati, I was sent back to Cincinnati. And we were supposed to be furthering engineering training. And hopefully there would be some engineers left over after the war was over.
Okay, and from Cincinnati, what happened?
Well, then the battle casualties in North Africa started to pile up, and they needed warm bodies. So some of the experienced men from units in training were sent overseas, and we were sent to various units in training. And I went to Camp Campbell, Kentucky, and to the 14th Armored Division.
And was that more extensive training? That was more than you had in the basic training?
That was entirely different, because that was I was sent to the armored divisions have three divisions: infantry, artillery, and the actual tanks. And I was in the in the artillery part, which was entirely different from infantry basic training.
So then you started to practice on the guns and learn how to use the weaponry more?
No, oddly enough, I had a little radio experience before I went in the service, and I was made a radio man in the communications section of the artillery.
Oh, okay. And when you were done with your training there, is that when you left for
Yes.
overseas?
Yes,
Can you tell me did you travel by ship?
yes,
And was it a regular transport?
yes.
Oh, okay. Did you get seasick?
Not until we had very calm waters. I guess we sailed south because it was warm. We could go out on deck. Let's see, when was the date? We left the 14th of October in 1944, and it was warm enough to be out on deck. And we passed through the Straits of Gibraltar, which was a beautiful sight, and on a dawn, beautiful clear dawn. And we weren't into the Mediterranean a few hours until the worst darn storm. Then everybody was seasick.
Oh, and you were so close at that point.
Yeah.
Where did you land in France?
Marseilles.
And what were your impressions?
Well, of course, at that time the harbor was still a wreck from the invasion in August. I believe August was the landing in southern France. And it was, you know, wreckage all around, and still the smell of dead bodies buried in the dockside destruction.
How old were you at the time? Do you recall?
Let's see, I must have been 19 at that time. That's a trick question.
What were your feelings? You were so young. What were your feelings?
Well, it seems to me as a young person, you probably surround yourself with a certain amount of numbness because everything is strange, and you're not accustomed to any of this. I'd never been, of course, on an ocean liner before, and sort of a numb resignation, I guess, would be my point of view.
Did you have adequate supplies?
Oh yes.
Everything was okay back
then? Yeah, we got left our old training tanks and everything else were left in the States, and they packed all new stuff. So, unfortunately, on this storm through the Mediterranean, the morning after the worst of the storm, we saw many of the tanks had been lost overboard, which made us feel like, well, we were not seasick for nothing. It was really a bad storm.
Yeah. Where were you sent then when you landed in Marseille?
We went north along the Rhone River. I can't think of the exact destination, but we went through the Voges Mountains.
Did you go by train?
Train, yes.
Did you see any combat when you got there? Was that the start of combat?
For us, yes. A little funny sidelight. We were all college students, and when we were assigned to this unit, there were a number of men over 35, pushing 40, who sort of resented us 18, 19-year-old kids. And when I slept on the box of grenades on the train going north, I got the respect of the driver of the half-track.
I guess you did. So now you're in combat.
Yes.
And when you say you worked with artillery, were you in charge of a certain gun, one of those BARs or something like that? Or
no, these are 105 millimeter howitzers, which were mounted on top of a vehicle which looked like a tank, but it had no top, so this gun was much bigger than the tank guns, which were 75 millimeters. 75 would be about 3 inches. 105 is a 4-inch gun.
Was it a stationary,
or
was it mobile?
Oh, yeah.
I see. Someone else would be driving it, or did you?
No, I wasn't on the gun. I was in what we called a forward observer. So we would go out in something called a half-track. It has steerable wheels in front and tracks like a Caterpillar tractor in back. And of course the tanks all had those Caterpillar tractor treads. Well, we would go forward and observe where the shells fell when I was in training in the U.S. Now, I guess they weren't satisfied with my training, because the sergeant in charge of the section took over that duty when we got into combat. And unfortunately, he was a family man, and he was one of the few men killed which sort of saved me.
Yeah, fate. So when he took over the duty, what were you doing then?
Well, it was sort of a reserve half-track. We had, remember our first day of actual combat, I was supposed to, a lieutenant came up and said, get headquarters on the phone, on the radio, excuse me. And these radios had like 4 or 5 channels which were fixed. You couldn't change them. So I poked the button, which was for headquarters, and the Germans had jammed it with a symphony. So this was rather startling introduction to actual combat.
Can you tell me your feelings? Tell me a little bit about what was going on and how you felt during that time. Do you remember?
Well, of course, you're not exactly comfortable. And, during the combat here, all of a sudden we're coming upon dead soldiers, which is not a nifty sight for a 19-year-old that's never even played football. And again, this sort of, I guess, numb resignation took over. And, you just did what you had to do.
Were there any casualties from your unit?
Yes, in fact, the first, a rather odd incident, the first day of combat, we went through a French village. And I'm sorry, I can't think of the name of it. It's in northeastern France, up near the Strasbourg area. And the citizens were out cheering and throwing flowers and all that bit that you see on the newsreels. And along came a German observation plane. And I guess none of our gunners had ever taken artillery or aircraft identification. Of course, having been a model builder, I knew instantly it was a German plane, and nobody opened fire on it. So fortunately, we ran through the village pretty quick because that fellow was sending radio signals back to the German artillery, which very soon landed all over that village. Unfortunately, the master sergeant of the whole battalion, his map blew out of his half-track. He went out of the armored vehicle to get it and was killed. That was our first casualty, one of the most important people in the unit.
You told me that there were some people from Cincinnati with you and that there were a couple of casualties there. Marymount?
Oh, this is another place.
Oh, okay.
But people I was inducted with were killed in the Hurtgen Forest, which was 150 miles away from where we were in the Battle of the Bulge, which is entirely separate in time and space.
What was your duty at that time? What were your orders? Were you...
Just the radio.
But was the unit, were your orders to go forward, or were you supposed to hold something, or take over the town, or what was going on?
Well, by the time we got into combat, which would be late November, an army in that position is sort of forced into a slowdown. You may remember General Patton raced across France from June from the landing in Normandy, and he almost got to the Rhine, which was our objective. And he ran out of gas. They just couldn't get the gas to his tanks to go on forward, so everything stalled for the winter. So we went to Haguenau. I remember Haguenau is on the border of, I think, Belgium, and also Wissembourg. We were stuck in Wissembourg for weeks or a month, and that was a German border. Incidentally, I got my first view of Germany. We somehow we commandeered a jeep and rode through what had been the customs office on the French-German border and actually penetrated into Germany. About that time, somebody decided to start shooting at us, so we went back to France.
What were your living conditions like at the time? I guess.
Well, the artillery had it pretty good because we usually had some sort of a shelter over our heads. An abandoned factory or a schoolhouse in Wissembourg. We had an actual house where we quartered, and we could be fairly warm there, as opposed to the poor guys in the infantry that were out sleeping in the snow. And
did you have rations, enough to eat?
oh yeah,
and,
sure.
And was your clothing adequate for the conditions?
Well, I'm a cold-blooded person. There's not enough clothing to be outside in the winter. But yes, they were.
Pretty good. Can you tell me one or two of your most memorable experiences from that time? Anything that stands out in your mind?
From the area of combat?
Well, just during your time of service.
Oh, gee. I guess, that first day of combat, you kind of replay some of that in your mind and figure, a little here, a little there, it could have been me. And I guess I'm backtracking a little bit. Before I went overseas, I had gotten an appointment to Annapolis, and from Senator Taft. You take a test, and if you do well on the test and you're not a criminal, then you can get an appointment. But my eyes weren't good enough. I had 20/20, but only in one eye. And then the second memorable thing was they thought maybe I could pass into the Army, so I had an appointment from Representative Elston to West Point, the Army. And what had happened then during this time of combat, that appointment came through, and I guess I had sort of a memorable journey back. They cut me a stack of orders about an inch high, said, get from where you are to Amherst College in Massachusetts by any available Army transport. So I think I rode everything but an amphibious vehicle getting back from France to the U.S. And I guess one of the memorable things was coming into New York and seeing a blackout in the U.S., because of course we were used to blackouts in the combat area. And incidentally, passing through Paris, and on the way back, we had it snowed. The French citizens took everything off and went out and played in the snow because they had never seen that kind of a snow. And we were in a hotel which the U.S. Army had taken over for veterans for rest and rehab. Some of those fellows wanted to go out and associate with the female citizens of Paris, so us rookies got to sleep in their rooms. That was one of 5 buildings in the whole of Paris that was heated that winter. And that includes the Folies Bergère, which was not heated. That was interesting.
Okay, so you got your appointment, then you were sent back to the States?
Yeah.
Is that what happened?
Yeah, we had, they sent us back to study for the entrance exam to West Point. So I spent a month at Amherst College in Amherst, Massachusetts, and then we were sent to Cornell in about 2.5 months. I took the West Point exam in June. I guess one other memorable thing when we this is sort of silly, but we had a number of combat veterans that were appointed, field appointments. That means they were in combat when they got their appointment, and you don't have quite the spit and polish in those field units that you do, especially at West Point. So we were assembled for some ceremony. I think it was after we took the actual oral and written exam, and we were sort of standing around in the courtyard. You probably have seen in movies that the West Point barracks are sort of a big quadrangle, I think it was, about 4 stories high, and the bugle blows and all the cadets come racing out and line up in perfect lines. Well, we were standing around down there lounging and talking and doing everything. Some of us were under the command of people who already had an officer's rating, but they were pretty lax too. So the colonel at West Point came out and looked over this mob scene of us personnel down there, and he hollered at the top of his voice, "Get that rabble in order down there." So we figured that was one of the first times we'd been addressed as a rabble.
Did they send you back overseas then, or did you
No.
stay in the States?
No, after that they took more rigorous physical. I guess it was at Camp Croft, or maybe it was at Fort Dix, and they found that what they thought was some sort of residue on the lung. And I think possibly they regarded me as a troublemaker, and that was a good reason to throw me out of the service. So, but otherwise, of course, many of the people that had served all through Europe were pretty worried that they were going to be sent to the Pacific where the war was still hot. And I kind of think of that today when I see the folks at home and the folks in Iraq complaining about their length of service. When we were drafted, nobody said anything about length of service. Your length of service was when the war was over, not a certain number of months. And I know I had a cousin that served 5 years. He was served before Pearl Harbor, and the very last day of combat after the Pacific War was over, he was still in service. So that sort of throws a little different light on and thinking of even the World War I song, "We won't be back till it's over there," that you didn't go in with any length of time involved at all. It's an entirely different situation.
Can you tell me what you feel was your biggest achievement during your time in the service?
Oh, I guess successfully passing exams well enough to be appointed to the service academies. I don't think as a combat person, I don't think I contributed very much that way, just a hot body that was available. But I think that would be my most memorable thing.
When you were in Europe, did you receive mail at all?
Oh, yeah.
Family?
Oh, yeah. I think probably there again, being in the artillery unit, you were probably much better supplied than the infantry fellows. It was pretty hazardous just getting them food and stuff there, whereas we were several miles back and transportation was much easier for ammunition, food, supplies. And
did you develop any close friendships?
oh, we had, I think so. We kind of have petered out now. Of course, at our age, the people are dropping off. I guess my closest friends in the service were the other younger guys that were brought from ASTP in to fill in positions. So we were all in the communications section.
Did you keep up with any of them after the war?
Well, with one fellow, I finally lost track of him some years ago. And but other than that, it was sort of an odd situation. College kids were not exactly warmly welcomed in this unit, so it was not a buddy-buddy situation. I think if I'd have been on a tank crew where you had either 6 or 8 men, it would have been a different story.
Did you, how did you feel about your officers that were in charge? What did you think of them?
Oh, oddly enough, our captain was only a few years older than myself. He was only 23 at the time, Captain Alexander. And he lived here in Marymount for a while after the war. He didn't seem too pleased to see me, oddly enough. But he went on to become, I think, the Internal Revenue Service Commissioner. And was an outstanding fellow, and we had another fellow that was a recent West Point graduate. And in general, pretty good. Always in the service, you run into people that sort of take advantage of their rank, and that wasn't always too great, but in general, I think we'd say we were pleased with it. I got one funny incident. Have you got time for another funny incident? Our first sergeant, who's the fellow that calls the roll after reveille, the first day I was there, he was from Boston. And we had a fellow whose name was spelled B-E-C-K-A. And he called Becker. And I answered here. And he got all over me for that. And I had more time in the KP and guard duty than I'd care to think about.
Did he say them both the same?
Yeah, oh yes, being
and
Austin. Yeah, naturally that threw me off right away.
Oh, um, that just threw me off. Did you carry anything for good luck when you were in combat or do anything?
Not really.
No. Did you keep a log or
No.
a journal? No. What do you feel is the most important thing that you learned from your time in the service?
Once you got out, stay out. Unfortunately, we're taught in this country to be individuals. And in the service, you're taught to absolutely follow the orders of everybody in a rank above you. And of course, when you're a private, everybody is in a rank above you, and you're unconditionally supposed to obey what they say, whether it's logical or not. So the difference between that and civilian life is quite marked.
I get the impression from some of the things you've said that was difficult for you to just follow orders.
Oh yeah, yeah. Me and myself and the first sergeant were at loggerheads from the very first morning.
You finally learned to just do what they said, and
Oh, you had to, of course. But you know, you didn't. You did what you were said, but you internally you sort of might be somewhat resentful or rebellious would be another term.
Is there anything that you would like to add to the interview that we haven't covered?
No, I don't think so. I don't recall any other incidents that are of importance there. I guess I would have to say, I can't say I'm ungrateful for having been in service, because when we had the GI Bill, this was certainly a boost to my education and a great relief financially as far as my parents were concerned. The time in service carried me through liberal arts college and most of the way through dental school. I went to Northwestern, graduated as a dentist, and engineering was a thing of the past.
What made you change?
Well, my parents were both dentists.
I see.
My mother was a lifelong, of course, all my parents are lifelong, I should say I'm a lifelong resident of Marymount. They came here in 1925 when I was 6 months old. And my mother practiced dentistry here in Marymount up until 1950 when she died, when I was still in dental school. And my father was a dentist also, practiced downtown. They practiced together with my uncle before I was born for 5 years. So we have, I guess, deep roots in Marymount. I guess I'm probably one of the town dinosaurs because I lived in the same house since 1927.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time to come in for the interview.